They tore up my mother's letter right in front of me, calling it a lie, while the whole family watched in silence. My name is Isabel, and I was the daughter-in-law who no one believed. But that letter, it held the secret that could change everything about our inheritance and expose who my husband truly chose to protect. Would you have stayed quiet or risked everything like I did? Tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were in my place? The morning my mother-in-law died, the February air in California tasted like metal. I walked into the Vietnamese community funeral hall with my hands in my coat. Low voices rose around the altar. On the table, framed by chrysanthemums, her photo watched us with that strict calm that used to make me sit up straight. On my wedding day, she had leaned close and whispered, "Be patient, and you will keep the house." I laughed then, thinking she meant harmony. Today the sentence returned and pressed under my heel. Be patient, keep the house. The words did not comfort me. They fenced me in. Carlos stood near the entrance, shaking hands, saying thank you, red-eyed and tireless. He smiled at me, asking me not to make trouble. My father-in-law drifted between groups, shoulders pulled back, voice careful, balancing grief with reputation. Valeria cried loudly by the altar. Her sobs sounded rehearsed. The aunties murmured that she was devoted. I placed tea on the offering tray and bowed. The room smelled of incense, wax, and the citrus peel tucked into a plate for fragrance. A metal coat rack leaned under borrowed jackets. I kept trying to be useful. I poured tea. I folded napkins. I showed people where to sign. Grief is a busy kind of silence. It gives your hands tasks while the mind refuses to sit. When the first wave of visitors left for lunch, the hall grew hollow. Carlos stepped outside to take a call. The aunties argued in whispers about rice for the evening vigil. I slipped into the small preparation room behind the altar to look for candles. The door clicked shut. Boxes and plastic tubs lined the wall. Half hidden under a folded banner sat a scuffed brown suitcase. The handle was taped. I knew it at once. She kept it by the door at home for sudden trips. I touched the handle. I lifted the lid. Inside lay a knitted shawl, a tin for needles, envelopes of photos, bank slips, a small bottle of perfume. At the bottom, a flat envelope lay crosswise. My name was on the front in her precise handwriting. Isabel. I sat on a metal chair and shut the suitcase to cover my lap, as if the chair might tell on me. My hands trembled. I opened the envelope. The letter was on ruled paper. The first line was a simple apology. Time had run faster than her courage. If I held the letter, she wrote, she was already past argument. She mentioned a will. There was another version, the one she made when she was still strong. She did not trust the newest paper. She named places. The drawer with the false back. The safety deposit box. The red notebook of expenses. Her tone was careful. Outside, a prayer began in the hall. The letter said the house should never be a weapon for anyone. Families cut themselves with property. Be patient, she wrote, but do not be silent when the truth is at stake. She signed with the full name she used for documents. In a smaller line, she thanked me for sitting with her the week she could not eat. I read it again. The dates stood up like nails. The trusted will was made before the last hospital visit. The new one was signed when her hands already shook. 3 months ago, she had asked me to count her pills. If signatures could be questioned, if a notebook existed, I could not pretend not to know. A shoe scuffed at the door. I flattened the letter and looked up. The knob turned half an inch, then stopped. I slid the letter back into the envelope, tucked it inside my coat, and closed the suitcase with a careful click. When I opened the door, Valeria stood near the water jugs, wiping her eyes. She looked at me, then the room behind me. Her mouth curled. not quite a smile. "They are asking for you," she said. "The family wants a photo while the flowers are fresh." I nodded and walked past her. The carpet in the hallway swallowed my steps. I felt the envelope against my ribs. In the hall, people gathered again. The photographer lifted his camera. Carlos slipped an arm around my shoulders as if we were only a picture to frame. I let him. The shutter clicked. It sounded like a lid closing. After the photo, I moved to the back and stood near the coat rack. The letter burned like a secret candle under my coat. If I brought it out now, the day would split. If I hid it, the night would grow heavier. My father-in-law began to thank donors by name. I breathed in incense and orange. I slid my hand into my coat and pressed the envelope flat. "Not now," I told myself. "Wait until the house is quiet. Wait until the words can be heard." My heart tapped too fast, counting a rhythm I could not slow down. I drew the coat tighter, as if I could keep the secret from escaping through the seams, and stepped back toward the altar to pour more tea, the letter beating softly against my side. I did not sleep the night after the funeral. The candles had burned down to stubs, and their smoke still hung in the living room like a thin veil. I sat on the couch with my coat on and the envelope in my hands. The handwriting on the front was hers. Firm, tilted a little to the right. My name was the same as on the label she stitched into towels when I married into this house. The house itself was quiet in that brittle way that follows a long day. The flower stands rustled whenever the heater clicked on. A tray of cups waited near the teapot. In the corner, the altar light glowed red. I opened the envelope and smoothed the paper on my knees. I read the letter again from the beginning, sentence by sentence, like counting beads. She wrote about time. She wrote about strength. She wrote that a newer will existed, but that she did not trust it. She wrote that the will she believed in was made before the last hospital stay. She said the newer paper was signed when her hands shook and when medication made her mind cloudy. She asked me to hold on to the truth until I could bring it out with care. I heard my own breath. Slow, thin. I remembered the wedding day. I remembered how she placed me at the women's table. Away from the older men, away from talk of property. She tapped my wrist with a smile and said I should learn to listen before I speak. I told myself then that traditions are a kind of roof. Tonight the same rule felt like a lock. The women arranged plates. The men spoke about land and accounts. I felt my jaw tighten. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. I folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope. Carlos walked through the living room, saw me, and set his phone face down on the table. His tie was loose. His eyes were red in a way I could not read. He asked if I had slept. I said no. He rubbed his forehead and said tomorrow we should talk to his father about a family meeting. He said it kindly, as if good planning could untangle grief. Behind him, Valeria drifted past the doorway, a blanket around her shoulders. She pretended not to look at my hands. She poured water, clinked a spoon at the sink, and then lingered by the hallway as if she had forgotten something. Carlos asked if I needed tea. I said I was fine. He left his phone on the table and went to the kitchen to find something to eat. Valeria moved closer and peered at the altar light, her face smooth and pale. She asked me if the smoke bothered my eyes. I said it did not. She glanced at the envelope. Then she turned away and pulled the blanket closer. The letter mentioned a deposit box. It also mentioned a notebook. She called it the Red Book. Expenses, dates, names of the people who brought cash or took it for errands. She wrote that the notebook proved intent. She underlined that word. Intent. I pictured the notebook in her narrow handwriting, columns drawn with a ruler, entries neat as a ledger's clerk. I rose and went to the small study where the printer sat on a credenza. The study had a door that did not close all the way. Carlos and I had used the printer for taxes. I shut the living room lamp, leaving only the altar light, and stepped into the study. I fed the letter into the scanner and pressed the copy button. The machine hummed, then blinked. The paper slid out, warm at the edges. I copied the second page, then the envelope itself, because even the envelope could matter. I slipped the copies into a plain folder and tucked the folder beneath the cushion of the couch where I had been sitting. I put the letter back into the envelope and slid it inside my coat once more. When I turned, I saw a shadow at the door. Valeria's blanket brushed the frame. She was looking at the candles again. She said she could not sleep. I told her the same. She glanced at the printer and asked if something was wrong with the memorial cards. I said I was checking paper. She nodded and ran her finger along the edge of the bookshelf, collecting dust on the pad of her finger. My father-in-law came out of his room a little later, hair flattened on one side. He thanked me for staying up. He said we would meet tomorrow afternoon, after lunch, when most of the relatives had left. He wanted to keep the discussion brief and respectable. He stressed the word, respectable. He looked at Carlos's phone on the table and then at me, as if I were expected to manage the tone of the day. When he went back to his room, I sat again and opened the letter one more time. I traced the underlined line about intent. The red notebook. A drawer with a false back. The safety deposit number with a single digit crossed out and corrected. Her pen had pressed hard into the paper there. I pictured her at the kitchen table, upright, careful, choosing each word. Carlos returned with a plate and asked me to eat. I shook my head. He told me Valeria had been up, restless, and that we all needed rest. He touched my shoulder in a way that felt like a reminder rather than comfort. Then he gathered his phone and walked toward the hall. I stood to stretch my legs. At the doorway, I heard a voice. Valeria's voice came from the kitchen, low and quick, the words slipping under the hum of the refrigerator. She said we would have to discuss division anyway. She said the phrase that made my stomach go cold. Divide the property. I froze with my hand on the doorframe and listened to the murmur fade. I looked down at the envelope pressed flat against my ribs and thought of the red notebook waiting somewhere in this house, and of a drawer that did not end where it appeared to end. Morning gathered itself like a knot in the middle of the living room. Chairs had been pulled into two uneven rows facing the altar, and a folding table stood between them with a neat stack of papers. Incense thickened the air until every breath tasted of bitter cinnamon. I arrived early with a tray of tea, but an aunt took it from my hands and told me to sit. She pointed to a low stool near the far corner, away from the table, near the coat rack. It was not said aloud, but I understood. I was here to witness, not to speak. The relatives arranged themselves with the confidence of old habit. Men sat first, knees wide, voices low and decisive. Women perched on the edges of chairs, ready to fetch water or paper towels, ready to nod. The altar light flickered. On the wall, a calendar still showed the month before, as if the house refused to turn the page. I watched the stack of papers as if they might move of their own accord. My coat felt heavy even though I had left it on the back of the stool. The envelope in its inside pocket had a weight that continued to press against me, a ghost of paper. The letter's lines repeated in my head. Intent. Red notebook. Drawer with a false back. I rubbed my palms on my skirt and tried to slow my breathing. When the room felt full enough, my father-in-law cleared his throat. He stood at the head of the folding table with his hands clasped behind his back. He thanked everyone for coming so soon after the funeral day. He spoke about respect, about keeping the family name smooth as a polished bowl. Then he introduced the purpose of the meeting. It would be simple, he said. They would review the will and make practical arrangements. Carlos took the chair beside him. straightened a stack of copies, and looked around as if counting witnesses. His eyes passed over me and did not stop. Valeria sat opposite, a pale scarf around her neck, hands folded in her lap with saintly neatness. When she saw me tucked near the coats, she tilted her head with a look that mixed pity and triumph. An uncle muttered that it was better to settle things now, before more relatives arrived for the weekend vigil. Someone else said the first anniversary would be the proper time for a larger remembrance, but that the essentials could be decided today. The phrase first anniversary landed like a coin in a jar. It would come, and with it, a new round of speeches. My stomach tightened at the thought of another public stage. Carlos cleared his throat and began to read. He said the will named him executor. He said the house would remain under his stewardship to ensure stability. He said the shop would be placed under the family trust, with business decisions to be made by him after consultation. He spoke smoothly, with the careful politeness of a bank manager, as if grief and paper could share a table without dripping into each other. I felt heat rush to my face. The words were not simply about property, they were about who counted. I remembered wiring money in our first year of marriage when the shop needed repairs. I remembered the note his mother sent afterward, thanking Carlos and telling me to keep receipts for my own household. The memory slid under my ribs like a cold knife. I had told myself then that contribution did not need applause. Today, the lack of applause sounded like a verdict. An aunt coughed and asked if there were provisions for care, for the little memorial masses, for the donation in his mother's name. Carlos nodded and tapped a paragraph. He had thought of that, he said. Valeria smiled and spoke up for the first time. She said, I must be relieved to see the family so well organized. The room made a soft, agreeable noise, that hum people make when they want the next part to be over. I stood halfway, then sat. My father-in-law lifted a palm without looking at me, the way a man quiets a child in church. Let us finish, he said. His voice remained calm, but there was iron under the calm. He gestured to Carlos to continue. The elder men leaned forward. The younger ones looked at their phones and then guiltily tucked them away. The altar light hummed. Carlos read the final allocation. There would be an allowance for household maintenance, released at his discretion. He let the sentence hang. At his discretion. A thin ringing started in my ears. From the corner, I saw the edges of the copies catch a current from the heater and quiver. I swallowed and forced my voice through a narrow opening. May I ask to see the signatures? The room turned its head as one. Carlos smiled without warmth and said the copies were already distributed to the people who needed them. Valeria laughed softly, a small bell of sound. She said some things are family matters and should stay among those who have always borne the weight. I heard the old pattern in her words. Men who decide, women who serve, outsiders who keep quiet. I pressed my tongue to the roof of my mouth so I would not say something that could not be unsaid. My father-in-law spoke again, slower. This is straightforward, he said. We are following tradition. The eldest son takes responsibility so the name does not scatter. If there are concerns, we will welcome them in the right time and place. His eyes landed on me then, a gentle push back into my corner. Right time, right place. The phrase drew a box around me. The conversation flowed on. Numbers were read, deadlines mentioned, keys accounted for. When it seemed the stack of papers had been emptied of its sentences, the room exhaled. People began to stand. I did not. I stared at the table where the copies had been. A damp ring from a teacup left a faint brown circle on the wood. I imagined placing the letter there and watching the circle spread into the ink. I imagined voices rising like startled birds. Carlos gathered the remaining copies and tucked them into a folder. He turned toward me then, as if remembering I existed, and walked over. He crouched so our faces were level. His voice was almost kind. He said not to worry about technicalities. He said the family knew what was best for the house. Then he added, lightly but with an edge that scratched, that I did not have standing to decide property matters. Not in this house. The sentence landed so quietly that at first I thought I had misheard. Then the words settled and arranged themselves into a shape I recognized. I felt something inside me pull taut, a line that had been slack for years. I folded my hands together to hide the way they shook. The letter pressed against my breastbone like a small shield. Around us, the relatives began to talk about lunch, about who would bring rice and who would wash the bowls. The ordinary noise rose and covered the moment like dust. I stood at last. My knees throbbed from the low stool. I thanked the aunt who had taken the tea tray from me. I nodded to the uncles as they shrugged on their jackets. The air near the doorway was cooler. Carlos had already turned away, folder tucked under his arm, talking logistics with his father. Valeria brushed past me and left a ribbon of perfume that smelled like lemons and static. At the coat rack, I slipped my hand inside my jacket and touched the envelope. The paper was warm from my skin. I held it the way a swimmer holds breath. There would be another gathering, I heard someone say, when the first year passed and the headstone was set. A bigger audience, someone answered. My eyes returned to the altar. The red light burned steady. I closed my fist around the letter, felt the edges dig into my palm, and let the noise of the room thin into a hum I could step through. I told myself the only way forward was through the paper trail my mother-in-law left behind. The family wanted me to be silent, to sit in corners, to nod at decisions already made. But her handwriting in that letter was clear. Keep records. Do not throw away receipts. If she believed the proof existed, I would find it. Even if every glance in the house reminded me I was not counted as blood, even if each whisper in the hallway measured me as an outsider, I would search. The storage room was narrow, wedged between the kitchen and the garage. Boxes stacked against the walls sagged under their own dust. Plastic bins with masking tape labels crowded the shelves. Tet 2017 decorations, Valeria school papers, Carlos taxes. The air smelled of mildew and mothballs. I pulled the chain for the bare bulb and shut the door behind me. I started with the suitcase I had opened at the funeral. It yielded nothing new. Then I knelt beside a box marked MISC Receipts. The handwriting was hers, small and precise. Inside were faded envelopes stuffed with grocery bills, gas station slips, pharmacy labels. I sifted through until my fingers were smudged with carbon dust. Nothing. Just the normal clutter of years. Carlos's footsteps passed by the hall. The door creaked a little with the change of air pressure. My chest stiffened, but he did not come in. He called my name once, lightly, then moved on. I kept still until his voice faded. Then I exhaled and went back to digging. At the bottom of another bin, tucked beneath a bundle of funeral programs, I saw a red spine, a notebook, corners bent, elastic band still holding. I tugged it free and brushed the dust with my sleeve. The cover was cloth, the kind sold in discount stores, but her name was written inside the front flap. Maria. The first pages were columns of dates and numbers, each line ruled with her neat hand. Expenses noted in Vietnamese shorthand. March 12th, cash given to Valeria for tuition. April 2nd, gas bill, Carlos reimbursed. Then small annotations in parentheses. Paid back, not paid back, balance. The book carried her voice more clearly than her photo did. She had documented every coin that passed through her hands. I turned pages faster. Each entry carried a tone, generosity or disappointment depending on repayment. Valeria's name appeared often. some circled and left unresolved. Carlos's name appeared less, usually tied to business expenses. My name appeared a few times. Isabel bought groceries. Isabel reimbursed cash. Always with check marks next to them. My throat tightened. She had noticed after all. I paused at the middle of the book. A folded slip was pressed between pages. It was a bank slip with her signature. She had deposited money in a secondary account under her own name, but the memo line said, Isabel Safekeeping. I touched the ink as if it might smudge into my finger. The room felt smaller as I read further. Numbers added into larger totals, notes about insurance payments, cross-references to a box key. She had built a map, page by page. Then on the last page, written in heavier strokes, she left a line. Money for Isabel to hold. Do not let them erase this. My hands shook as I closed the notebook. Proof. Not enough to win, maybe, but enough to stand on. Enough to explain why she had written to me, not to them. I heard the floor creak outside. The doorknob turned just a fraction before stilling. My heart thudded against my ribs. I pressed the notebook against my chest and stepped back into the shadow of the shelves. The light buzzed overhead. Whoever stood outside did not enter, but the pause was long enough to know they were listening. When the knob finally released, I exhaled. I slipped the notebook inside a canvas bag and tucked the bag under my arm. Later, I would scan it with Julia's help. For now, it had to remain secret. I turned off the bulb, stepped into the hallway, and pulled the door closed with care. The house was quiet, too quiet. I walked toward the living room, the red notebook pressed to my side like a pulse, knowing the game had begun. The small memorial meal began at dusk, the altar lights casting a warm red over the bowls and plates. Steam rose from the pot of braised pork, and the scent of fish sauce mingled with incense until it felt like memory itself had a flavor. The aunties arranged dishes in quiet loops of movement, setting chopsticks parallel, tucking orange slices along a rim for color. I carried a kettle around the table and refilled cups without being asked. When I glanced up, Valeria sat across from me with a soft smile that showed no teeth. She pushed a strand of hair behind her ear and said she would pour the soup so nothing spilled. The room hummed with the polite murmur people use when grief and appetite try to share the same space. We bowed our heads while my father-in-law murmured a short prayer. He thanked the ancestors, thanked his wife, thanked the guests. His voice cracked once, and he tightened his jaw. When we lifted our faces again, Valeria leaned toward the aunt on her right and said how exhausting the past days had been, how much work it was to host. Her hand brushed the back of my chair as if I were a vase to steady. She said some people get tired even when they do not do much. The aunt tittered. I refilled her cup with tea until the amber reached the brim. I had promised myself to keep my voice low, to let the night glide by, but Valeria's next line floated just loud enough for the table to catch it. She said the household carried a lot of weight and that some branches of the family had done most of the carrying for years. Chopsticks paused mid-air. Someone made a soft, sympathetic sound. My father-in-law kept his eyes on his bowl. He did not correct her. I felt the letter under my blouse like a warm plaque. I breathed through my nose and counted to 5. She asked if I had found a job in the past year that matched my skills, that the economy was difficult, that sometimes it was easier to stay home while others managed business. To the table, it sounded like concern. To me, it sounded like a pin pressed carefully into skin. I remembered the transfer I had made for her last spring. Money she said she needed for a certification course. She had promised to pay it back in 3 months. The notebook in the storage room had shown an entry with her name and a circle around the amount. No checkmark beside it. The aunt to my left whispered that I should eat, that grief knocks the appetite loose but rice would help. I thanked her. Across the table, the cousins compared funeral photos and tried to choose which one to print for the shrine. Valeria sighed that printing was expensive when you ordered overnight. Then she smiled toward me and said some of us are lucky, being married into stability, having a roof we did not need to build. People laughed softly, grateful for a gentle joke. I set my chopsticks down and wiped the rim of my cup with a napkin. I asked Valeria if the certification had gone well. The question was mild. She blinked, then recovered. She said she had decided to delay it because the house required attention. I nodded and asked whether she had told Mother that. The table grew quieter. She said Mother had always trusted her to prioritize the family. I said Mother trusted anyone who kept receipts. I did not raise my voice. I let the words sit in the steam between us until her eyes sharpened. The aunt on her right changed the subject to the cost of flowers. Valeria steered it back with a soft insistence. She said in some families, the wife of the son contributes in spirit, while the children of the house shoulder the practical burden. My teeth met. I said spirit costs more than people think when you have to hold it still in front of witnesses. She smiled, tilted her head, and asked if I felt misunderstood. Her tone wore kindness like a borrowed coat. I poured tea for my father-in-law. He thanked me without looking up. I turned to Valeria and described the day in late April when she texted me for a loan. I said I had transferred the amount within the hour. I said Mother's notebook had noted it. I asked whether she needed more time to repay. The words were simple, but the table went still. Valeria's lips parted. A cousin coughed into his sleeve. An uncle stared into his soup as if the answer lay somewhere near the tofu. Valeria said I must be confused, that I was mixing up months. I said I could show the transfer on my phone. I did not reach for it. I let the possibility hang like a lantern. She flushed, then laughed. A brittle sound. She said family should not keep score. I said Mother kept score not to punish, but to remember fairness when memory thinned. The aunties looked down. Someone placed a bowl of greens in front of me and then pulled it back as if it might burn. She tried again, softer, saying that in our house women were protected from ugly details. She said I should not feel pressured to understand accounts. I thanked her for her protection and told her I understood enough to sign my name and read numbers. I asked if she remembered the sweet rice I brought to the fundraiser for her friend, how Mother insisted I take home a plate for later. The memory loosened the corner of my chest, then tightened again. I saw Valeria's gaze flick to my father-in-law. He kept chewing, jaw steady, eyes flat. The cousins began to talk at once, too loudly, about nothing. Valeria lifted her bowl and drank broth to hide her face. When she set it down, she whispered that I should be careful with words in front of guests. I replied that I had been careful for years. Her chin lifted. She said if I felt I had contributed, I could submit receipts to Carlos, who would decide what counted as household. The word decide slid across the table and stopped in front of me. I smiled. I said I had already submitted to the person who mattered most. The notebook had heard me. A chair scraped. The sound ran along my spine. My father-in-law set his bowl down and pressed his palm to the table. Enough, he said. The syllables dropped like a stone into a pond. Conversation collapsed around them. He looked at me for the first time that evening and then at Valeria, then down at his hand. We will finish the meal, he said, and we will keep peace in this house tonight. The urge to speak surged to my throat and stalled there. I lowered my eyes to the table, felt the pulse in my ears, and lifted the teapot with both hands to keep them from shaking. After the memorial meal, I slipped on my coat and walked into the cold. Incense clung to my hair. I drove with the window cracked, letting February sting my eyes until the house felt a few streets behind me. The Vietnamese church stood 4 turns away, a low brick wedge under a dim sky. Its lights were on, a few cars along the curb. Inside, the nave was nearly empty. I chose a pew halfway down and laced my fingers, the way I do when I need my hands to stop shaking. I saw my mother-in-law at her last mass, back straight though breath was thin. After communion, she squeezed my fingers. "Keep the receipts," she had whispered once. "Do not throw them away." A side door opened. Father Raphael stepped out, adjusting his stole. More silver in his hair, the same alert kindness in his eyes. He recognized me and came down the aisle without hurry. We exchanged the words people use first. Was it peaceful? Is the house quiet? And then I said it. I found a letter. He led me into the side chapel where a small heater hummed. We sat on folding chairs facing a statue of Saint Joseph. I described the envelope, the handwriting, the underlined word, intent. I told him about a red expense notebook, about a new will signed when medicine fogged her hands, about dates that stood up like nails. He listened with silences wide enough to set truth on the table. He said she had come 2 days before the last hospital admission. She brought a list, folded twice, and read it slowly. She spoke of a trustworthy will and another she did not trust. She spoke of pressure. She wished for peace, but not at the cost of erasing what was right. He asked if she had told the family. She looked at the crucifix and said she would, when courage rose. I asked what she wanted for the house. He said she did not want it to become a weapon. He repeated the sentence, "Not a weapon," as if the echo might blunt any edge. She did not want caution mocked as ingratitude. The word lodged in my chest like a pebble finding the bottom of a pool. I told him there would be another meeting at the first anniversary, that decisions were draped in the cloth of tradition, that my place had been a corner near the coats. He winced. Then I asked if he would speak for her if needed. Write what he remembered. Stand in a room where paper and names argue. He looked toward the statue and back. Priests tread carefully around wills, he said, around money, around the storms that rise in houses after a death. But a truth heard in time is mercy. We sat without talking. A bus sighed outside. The stained glass shivered. I felt the letter inside my coat warming like a small animal. I asked if he would record the date and his recollection. He nodded. From his pocket he drew a narrow notebook, wrote the day, my name, and 3 lines about her visit and the phrase she repeated, "Not a weapon." He signed his initials. He said he would prepare a fuller statement when I brought copies of the letter and the red ledger. He warned that the road from evidence to recognition was long, that families like to fold paper until it disappears in a drawer. I said I had already found a drawer that did not end where it should. He told me to go slowly, to keep the book safe, to scan it with someone I trusted. I said my friend Julia could help. He knew her mother from the parish. "Good," he said. He rose, set his hand on my shoulder, and gave a blessing so simple it felt like a sheet pulled smooth. At the votive rack I lit a candle. The flame touched my thumb and made me hiss. I whispered thanks to the woman who taught me to label envelopes in blue ink. The doors breathed cold onto my face as I stepped outside. I drew my coat tight and started down the steps. From the shadow near the vestibule came the dry scrape of a shoe. I paused. The door side shut behind me. A figure separated from the brick, scarf looped high, phone screen winking in the streetlight. My name, a soft call. I did not move. The voice came again, lower now, each word placed with care. "You should be careful. They will stand against you." Night settled on the house like a damp cloth. The hallway was dark, the hum of the heater steady, the smell of incense faint but still there. I closed our bedroom door and leaned my shoulder against it until the latch clicked. Carlos sat on the edge of the bed with his tie loose and his shoes off, scrolling through his phone as if the screen could explain the day better than I could. When he looked up, his face tried to be gentle. He asked if I had been to the church. I said yes. He asked if the priest had said anything helpful. I said the priest remembered her words. He patted the space beside him. I sat, leaving a palm's width of sheet between us. I told him I had found a red notebook in the storage room. I said it was full of entries, careful and dated, and that my name was written with check marks. I expected him to ask to see it. He did not. He rubbed his thumb along the edge of his phone and said we should think about the future, not the past. He said this house had carried the family for a long time. He said his mother believed in stability. He said the will established that stability and that I should trust the process. The words process and stability sounded smooth, worn by use. He reached toward my hand, then thought better of it, and folded his hands in his lap the way men do at funerals. I reminded him of promises, the time he told me he would never let me stand alone in front of the family. The night he said my work was invisible, but not small. He smiled at that and said words spoken in soft hours are sometimes just comfort. We have to be practical now, he said. The term practical slid over my skin like cold glass. I told him the new paper was signed when she could hardly hold a pen. He said doctors do not make wills. He said families do. He said I should let the elders finish their work. He kept his voice even, as if evenness itself could erase a fact. I said there was another will, one she trusted. He asked me to stop digging. He said digging only turns the ground into a mess. I stood and opened the closet to hang my coat. He watched me in the mirror. He said something else then, almost as an aside, almost like a man speaking to his reflection. He said the house should stay with the bloodline. He said Valeria had always been here, had helped with the shop when he was in school, had driven their mother to appointments. He cleared his throat and added that he could keep the house safe for Valeria, at least until she settled down, and that this was what his mother wanted, really wanted, when she was strong. The mirror showed my face still, but something behind my eyes wavered. I asked if he meant that I should accept a place outside the door. He said no, of course not. Never outside, only that we should not disturb the structure that had held us. He stood and came closer. He said I could have the small apartment near the back if I needed more privacy. He said he would take care of the larger decisions with his father, and that I would not have to worry about anything. I asked if he had read the letter. He looked at the coat, and then at my hands. He said, we should not pass around papers that confuse people. He said letters written in pain can say things that create trouble. He did not ask me to show it to him. He did not ask what it said. He told me again to trust him. I felt the day tilt. A week ago, I would have leaned into his voice and let it hold me steady. Tonight, his voice felt like a curtain pulled across a doorway where light used to be. I sat back down on the bed and told him gently that I had made copies. His mouth tightened. He said copies invite gossip. He said a husband should not be surprised by the actions of his wife. I asked if he planned to keep the house for Valeria. The question stood between us, clear and ordinary. He sighed and spread his hands. He said it was the sensible path. He said Valeria had no one. He said I had him. I heard the arithmetic inside those lines. Sister first, wife second. Blood first, marriage second. Tradition first, truth second. He began to list reasons, taxes, paperwork, the way their mother had run things, the way donors expected the family to appear. He used the word optics and then laughed at himself. He said he was tired. He said the simplest path is usually the kindest. I remembered the night he promised that when it mattered, he would stand next to me, not an inch behind and not an inch ahead, but next to. I asked if this mattered. He did not answer at once. He stared at the floor and said calm would be better than a storm, and that a quiet wrong could be kinder than a loud right. He lifted his eyes to mine as if asking me to accept that phrase as a blanket we could sleep under. I stood and walked to the window. The streetlight threw a pale circle on the driveway. The red notebook lay in the drawer of my nightstand. I could feel its weight through the wood. I said I would not step back from what I had seen. He asked what I wanted from him. I said I wanted him to believe me. I wanted him to read her words and say we would not make the house a weapon. He closed his eyes and shook his head. He came to stand near me. He said he loved me. He said love means choosing peace. I said love means standing in front of the same truth. He put his hand on my shoulder. It felt like a nudge to move aside. I moved away. He let his hand drop. The quiet between us sounded like a door that had swung shut without a click. I sat on the floor and breathed until I could count again. I thought of the priest writing the date in his small notebook. I thought of the line my mother-in-law underlined. Intent. I thought of Valeria at the table, smile smooth, voice sweet, and of my father-in-law looking down while the words did their work. I saw the line of people at the anniversary to come. I tasted incense. Carlos said we were tired and should sleep. He said tomorrow he would talk to his father about moving forward. He turned off the lamp and lay down. I stayed on the floor a few breaths longer. Then I wiped my eyes with the heel of my hand. I pulled the red notebook from the drawer and pressed it to my chest. I whispered that I would not stop. If they stood against me, I would stand straighter. In the dark, with the heater humming, I felt tears slide warm across my face, and I let them fall without sound. Then I set the notebook back, lay down on my side of the bed, and stared into the night until the first thin hint of morning outlined the edge of the curtain. The community bank sat across from a PHO shop, windows painted with a spring promotion. Julia parked, checked my eyes the way a runner checks wind, and asked, "Do you have the letter?" I tapped my coat. "And the red ledger?" "In my bag." She nodded, lawyer calm, and we went inside. It smelled like paper and cleaner. A woman in a navy vest greeted us. Julia introduced herself and asked to speak with records about a supplemental account mentioned in a family document. She led us to a desk where a young man with a striped tie sat behind a tidy keyboard. His nameplate read, Min. Julia showed her bar card and a letter of representation I had signed that morning. Min checked our IDs, typed, frowned, typed again. "Do you have the last 4 digits?" I slid a copy of my mother-in-law's note across the desk. He read the corrected digit and the nickname she had written, Safekeeping. He nodded. "Give me a moment." He returned with a manager, Ms. Pham, and a thin folder. "For privacy," Ms. Pham said, "we can show activity if your name appears on the account." She pointed. Secondary account. Owner Maria. Authorized beneficiary Isabel. The word beneficiary dried my mouth. We read statements month by month. Small deposits. Then a larger one 2 months before the final hospitalization, with a memo in Vietnamese, "Keep for Isabel." Julia asked for withdrawals. Ms. Pham slid a page toward us. 3 withdrawals sat in a tight cluster 3 weeks later. Same branch, same teller ID. The signature on the slips was my mother-in-law's, neat but shaky. Julia asked for copies. Ms. Pham went to the copier. Min straightened the pen by the signature pad and kept his voice low. "Sometimes families come in together," he said. "Sometimes they don't." The copies arrived warm. Julia laid them in a row. "Look here," she said. "The authorization code is in a different hand." On the last slip, the memo read transfer to household. Under it, An internal receipt showed the destination account, checking Carlos. The world narrowed to the staple in the corner. My breath shortened. "We are not assigning meaning," Ms. Pham said. "We are simply providing records to a listed party." Julia thanked her and asked for the signature card. Ms. Pham printed a scan. The signature from account opening curved steady and firm, a year before the hospital stays. Julia aligned it with the recent slips. The differences were quiet but clear. Letter height, pressure, the final stroke rising instead of settling. She photographed the set for our file. We left with a manila envelope. Outside, faux steam drifted across the sidewalk. Julia set the envelope between us. "We'll scan everything at my office," she said. Julia's office light was cool and flat. We fed pages into the scanner, then photographed them on a grid with a ruler for scale. Julia dictated a chain of custody note while I read dates aloud. She checked hospital records against withdrawal days. On one of them, my mother-in-law was on IV sedation for a scan. Julia underlined the date and drew a star. She printed a timeline. Deposit labeled for me, then withdrawals. Then internal transfer to Carlos. She added my beneficiary listing and the signature card variations. She wrote Father Raphael, statement pending, and pinned it. She drafted next steps. Subpoena teller footage if retained, request audit logs, obtain medication charts. I held the red ledger open to the page where money for me was circled and felt steadier. "This matches her letter," Julia said. "It contradicts the story at the table. Keep the originals with you tonight. If anyone asks, say you're making copies for the memorial book. Truth travels safer when it looks boring." The hallway heater rattled. A clock ticked in the next room. I thought of Carlos saying a quiet wrong could be kinder than a loud right. I thought of Valeria's smile, of my father-in-law's palm on the table. The timeline lay between us like a small bridge. I could step onto it, one foot, then the next. Julia capped her pen. Her voice was soft, but certain. "This is enough to sue," she said. The whispers began before I stepped into the banquet hall. I could feel them cling to the walls like smoke, following me, wrapping around every nod and glance. By the time I reached the long table where platters of noodles and roast pork had been set out, the murmur had grown louder. Isabel forged papers. Isabel made up the story. Isabel is trying to steal. I had heard this rhythm before, years ago, when a cousin misplaced money during a wedding collection and pointed to me because I was the new wife, the outsider. That sting returned now, sharper because this time the target was not just my character, but the last words of a woman who had trusted me. Valeria was the one fanning the embers. She moved from group to group, her black dress swishing like a blade. I caught pieces of her sentences. Such a coincidence she found the letter after Mama died. So convenient Isabel has a copy when the original is missing. A woman desperate for security will do anything. People nodded, not because they believed her fully, but because it was easier to agree than to risk her scorn. The clinking of glasses called everyone to sit. The hall was bright, too bright. Chandeliers glaring down on our gathering of uncles, aunts, cousins, in-laws. At the head of the table stood Henry, tall as always, holding a spoon to the rim of his glass. His voice carried, "We are here to honor family, to preserve harmony." But whispers of forged papers threatened that harmony. Every eye turned to me. My throat tightened. Someone muttered, "She should explain herself." Another, "What kind of daughter-in-law does this?" The weight of accusation pressed like stone. Carlos sat beside me, but his chair felt empty. He did not defend me, only kept his gaze on his folded napkin. My pulse beat in my ears. Valeria leaned forward, her smile sharp. "Isabel, Why not show us your so-called evidence? Prove you didn't invent it. I remembered my mother-in-law's voice, telling me to keep receipts, to hold on to truth even when no one wanted to hear it. My fingers trembled as I reached into my bag. Slowly, deliberately, I unfolded the photocopy, the thin sheet that carried her handwriting. Gasps fluttered across the table. The letter's curves, her familiar phrasing, lay there in ink. A few relatives leaned closer, whispering to each other. Doubt cracked through the certainty Valeria had painted. I cleared my throat, steadying. This is not a story I invented. This is her hand, her words. She wanted the truth known. Valeria's face stiffened, then she barked a laugh. A photocopy? Anyone can make that. She turned to the others. Why is the original gone? Why only this convenient sheet? The tension snapped when Henry stepped forward. He did not ask a permission. He simply reached out, quick and commanding, and snatched the paper from my grasp. The rustle of it being folded and hidden into his coat pocket silenced the hall. Enough, he declared, his voice ringing like a gavel. This matter ends here. No more talk of letters, no more accusations. Family unity is worth more than scraps of paper. I stared at him, stunned, my hand still frozen in the air where the sheet had been. Around the table, people shifted, unsure, their certainty shaken. I caught the eyes of two cousins. They looked away, but not before I saw the flicker of doubt. Doubt that maybe I was not lying. Doubt that maybe something deeper was buried. The banquet resumed in an uneasy hush, forks scraping against plates, conversations forced and shallow. Yet the seed had been planted. No matter how firmly Henry tucked that copy into his pocket, the image of my mother-in-law's handwriting had already seeped into their minds. I lowered my gaze to the tablecloth, heart hammering, breath uneven. The fight was not over. In fact, it had just changed shape. They thought they had silenced me, but doubt, once sown, has a way of growing roots. The Tran ancestral memorial felt both holy and strategic. Incense layered the hall, a recorded drumbeat like a slow heart. Uncles in dark suits, aunties with pearl pins, cousins whispering. A polished family tree shimmered. My face wavered in the brass plate at its root. In the parking lot, Julia checked my bag. A photocopy of the letter, bank statements, the red ledger wrapped in a towel, a one-page outline, dates, signatures, withdrawals, and the word my mother-in-law underlined, intent. Wait for the right moment, Julia said. Speak once plain. Put the papers where every eye can see. I repeated the plan until it felt like prayer. We entered by a side door. Carlos arranged fruit at the altar and did not look at me. Valeria drifted like a hostess, smile lacquered on. When she saw my bag, she murmured, "Keep today simple, no scenes." I let the sentence pass. Simplicity is one kind of order, truth is another. Ritual came first. Bowing, pouring tea, a brief eulogy for elders who opened groceries in strange towns. Henry spoke about duty and reputation, about choosing a single spine for the family to stand behind. While he spoke, I watched the banquet table. A lacquer tray in its center reflected the chandelier. That tray would be my stage. When the prayers ended, Valeria moved to block me, palm light on my bag. "Give that to Henry," she said. "He'll keep it safe." "I'll show it," I answered. Her smile did not move, her eyes did. "Mama hated scenes." "Mama hated weapons," I said. "Especially houses used as weapons." Julia touched my elbow. "Now." I stepped to the lacquer tray and lifted my voice clear enough to carry. "I need 3 minutes," I said. Heads turned. Before Henry could speak, I laid out the photocopy, the signature card from account opening, the bank summary, and the red ledger open to the line, "Money for Isabel to hold." I stepped back so no hand could snatch without an audience. A hush formed. I followed the outline. There are 2 wills, I said. One made when she was strong, one when medicine shook her hands. Here are deposits labeled for me, then withdrawals during sedation, then a transfer to Carlos. This is her ledger, and this, I touched the copy, is her warning not to let the house become a weapon. An aunt leaned in. That's her hand. A cousin lifted a phone, then lowered it. Doubt moved like a shadow learning its shape. Valeria tried to laugh. Private paper isn't a display. She reached. Several heads turned. Her hand hovered. Carlos said, "Let father speak." He looked to Henry. Henry stepped forward. Gaze on the letter. "This is theater," he said. "My wife's dignity is not a prop." "Her dignity is in her words," I answered. Julia raised a hand. "We can discuss process," she said, "but we can't unsee what's here." The room shifted. A great-aunt traced the ledger's margin. An uncle repeated the teller ID under his breath. I held my knees still. "I ask only that these be read aloud and kept in view," I said. "If we still disagree, a judge can read with us." Henry's mouth thinned. He set his palm beside the papers and looked at me. "Enough," he said. "You are lying." The word struck the tray. He didn't dare take the sheets. Too many eyes, but he bent close and hissed, "You embarrass this house. You are not blood. You are a storyteller." The old corner called to me, the stool by the coats, the quiet of consent. I swallowed it. "I am the witness she chose," I said. Henry turned to the family. "There will be no public reading," he announced. "No debate over forged copies at a memorial. This ends now." I gathered the copies, leaving Julia's card on the tray like a white truce. As I closed my bag, a cousin met my eyes and nodded. Seeds of doubt had found soil. Henry's voice followed as I moved toward the doors. "Liar," he said, louder, claiming the last word. I stepped into the cooler corridor, bag against my ribs, knowing the next room would have benches and a clock, and a person in a robe whose job is to read what families refuse to read. The air in the ancestral hall quivered with murmurs. I could hear whispers ripple like a current around the room, a storm building in low voices. My palms trembled as I held the photocopied letter and the red ledger against my chest. My knees wanted to fold, but I refused to move back. I remembered my mother's words, her last advice. "The truth will protect you." I repeated it silently as a prayer, even as my heartbeat slammed against my ribs. Henry's sharp voice cut across the crowd. "This farce has gone on long enough." His tone was heavy with authority, as though centuries of family order lived in his throat. He gestured for silence, and like obedient sheep, the cousins and uncles hushed. Valeria stepped into the quiet with her sly smile, eyes glinting with victory before the war even began. "She doesn't belong here," she said, her voice pitched sweet but aimed like a dagger. "Mama would never hide secrets in scraps of paper. This is desperate fabrication." I steadied my breath and lifted the ledger so everyone could see. These are her numbers, her handwriting, recorded carefully, month after month. "Look here, money given to me for safekeeping. Do you think I forged this? Every figure matches the bank's records." I laid the copy of the bank statement beside it. "And this?" I unfolded the letter, my mother's familiar hand dancing across faded lines. "This is her voice. She knew someone would try to silence her." Gasps fluttered. A cousin leaned forward. An aunt murmured, "That looks like her hand." For a moment the balance tilted. My chest rose with fragile hope. But Carlos stepped in, his face tight, eyes avoiding mine. "Enough, Isabel. You know this is false." His voice broke, but he pushed on. Mama wrote one will. One. She never gave you authority. You made this up. His words stung deeper than Valeria's venom. My own husband's betrayal echoed through the hall. Valeria laughed, seizing his support. See? Even her husband admits it. She's clinging to fantasies because she can't bear the truth. All this drama for money she doesn't deserve. She looked to Henry, daring him to strike the final blow. The room thickened with silence again, the air too heavy to breathe. I lifted the letter higher. If you doubt me, take it to an expert. Take it to court. I'm not afraid. What I fear is Mama's last wish disappearing under lies. My voice cracked, but it carried across the room. For a heartbeat, eyes softened, shoulders shifted. Doubt spread like a tremor. Then Henry strode forward. His large hand reached for the paper. I clutched it, resisting, but his grip was iron. You disgrace us all, he hissed. With one savage motion, he tore the paper in half. The sound of ripping fibers was louder than any shout. Gasps broke around us. I felt my breath shatter. My body froze, the jagged halves dangling from his fists like murdered birds. No more, Henry thundered, slamming the pieces onto the tray. This charade is finished. We will not poison this family with counterfeits. He glared at me, his eyes searing with the force of judgment. Carlos looked down. Valeria smirked in triumph. The room closed in, their faces blurred by tears pressing behind my eyes. The world tilted. My hope collapsed with that torn paper. My chest tightened. My hands shook uncontrollably. All I wanted was to scream, but no sound came. For a moment, despair swallowed me whole. Maybe they were right. Maybe the truth meant nothing here. Then a hand gripped mine, warm, steady. Julia's voice pierced the fog, low but fierce. Don't break. We still have another way. Her eyes burned into mine, steady, promising. I clung to her touch like a lifeline. Around us, voices rose again, cousins arguing, aunts whispering, the storm unleashed. But Julia leaned close and whispered in my ear. Words like a key. We take it outside these walls, to a place where Henry can't tear truth apart. I closed my eyes, the echo of ripping paper still in my ears. My heart bled with despair, but a spark flickered. Julia was right. There was another way. This wasn't the end. The courthouse smelled of paper and old coffee. Julia and I passed security with our folders held tight. No more trays at memorials. We entered a small courtroom where ceiling fans pushed a tired breeze. 2 short rows of benches held our relatives. Carlos sat on the aisle, hands clasped. Valeria perched beside Henry, chin high, scarf knotted like armor. The clerk called the case. Julia rose, voice even, and introduced us. Opposite, a man in a gray suit stood for the family trust. The judge, a woman with reading glasses in her hair, asked for brevity and clarity. Julia began with foundations. She marked for identification the letter copy, the red expense ledger, the beneficiary listing with my name, and the bank statements. She did not dramatize. She stacked facts where every eye could reach. Then the document examiner took the stand. She explained baselines and stroke order, pen pressure, natural variation. She placed the signature card from account opening beside the recent withdrawal slips and pointed to differences that do not come from a shaky hand alone. The defense asked about fatigue and medication. Could a sick woman sign oddly? The examiner nodded and said yes, sometimes. Then she traced the rising terminal stroke that never appeared in genuine specimens. The room hummed when she stepped down. Next came the hospital. A custodian produced certified records. A nurse from the ward testified in a calm voice about the scan, about sedation orders, about the drip of morphine. Julia showed the time-stamped chart. The nurse confirmed the window in which the new will was allegedly signed. In that window, she said, the patient would not be considered able to execute legal documents. Father Raphael followed. He swore and sat straight in his black suit. Julia asked when my mother-in-law came to him and what she said. He gave a date 2 days before the last admission. She feared a later paper would be used to turn the house into a weapon. He repeated her phrase, "not a weapon," and let it rest like a bell tone. The gray suit objected to relevance. The judge overruled. Julia handed up a certified copy of the earlier will, released from the bank box after notice. The judge compared dates, compared signature lines, glanced again at the medication chart. Her pen clicked against the pad. She pulled the papers into a neat stack, as if tidying a desk before a decision. When she spoke, her voice was even. The later will is invalid. The evidence shows incapacity and unreliable execution. The prior will controls. Any transfers from the supplemental account are to be traced and returned. A neutral administrator will be appointed. No party is to use the house as leverage. The words dropped into the record and sent out rings that reached the back bench. My knees went soft. Julia closed her folder and squeezed my hand. On the bench, Carlos bowed his head, fingers to his eyes. Valeria's composure broke. Tears slid quick and bright. Henry's jaw stayed hard, but his eyes flickered. The judge asked if anyone needed clarification. No one spoke. The clerk stamped the orders. The seal thudded like a new calendar being set. I breathed for the first time in weeks. Through the windows, a strip of pale sky widened. I pictured my mother-in-law at the kitchen table, ruler straight edge, counting and labeling, whispering, "Be patient, but do not be silent." Justice did not return her to me, but it gave her words a place to stand. We stepped into the corridor. The hum of vending machines sounded like a small peace. Julia exhaled and said quietly, "We did it." I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. When I opened them, Carlos stood one step away, searching for words that would not come. He lowered his gaze. From the doorway came Valeria's cry, thin and startled, like a bird hitting glass. On the back row, an aunt crossed herself and stared at the floor. A cousin who had laughed at dinner could not meet my eyes. The sound of paper moving felt suddenly respectful, as if the room understood what had been asked of it and answered plainly. The house was quieter than the courthouse hallway. Even the heater seemed to hold its breath. I stepped in first and took off my shoes in the entry, the way she taught me. The altar lamp glowed steady, a small red heart in the living room. Bowls and vases stood exactly where they always had. The familiar order made the silence feel heavier, as if the room remembered a different ending than the one we had just received. I carried the court folder to the table and left it closed. Paper had already done its work. The smell of incense lingered from the last vigil. I could still see the long meals that used to gather here. The fish steaming on a blue plate. The cousins telling the same stories about school and cars, her small corrections while she topped up tea. I had spent years trying to match the rhythm of those dinners, learning where to sit, how to greet, where to place my chopsticks so no one would frown. Those evenings felt far away now, like a film left in the sun. Henry came in, hat in his hands, back straight. The old command in the set of his shoulders. The command looked tired. He put the hat down and rubbed his forehead. He did not sit. He walked to the altar and bowed. When he turned, his eyes did not find me at once. They slid past the table, past the folded folder to the window, to the square of pale sky, and only then to my face. "I was wrong," he said. The words were simple and hard. His voice scratched a little as if it had been dragged over gravel. "I should have listened when you spoke. I should have read, not torn." He raised a hand and let it fall. I was afraid the family would fall apart if I allowed doubt in the door. It fell apart anyway, I said. I kept my voice even. I was too tired for sharp edges. He nodded as if that was the judgment he expected. I thought a clean story would protect us. I chose the story I knew how to tell. The son leads. The sister waits. The wife understands her place. I have told it for so long that I forgot to ask if anyone wanted to live inside it. He glanced at the altar again. Your mother knew. She tried to tell me. I did not want to hear. Carlos hovered in the doorway like someone who had brought the wrong key. He looked thinner than he had in the courtroom. He had taken off his tie, but not his caution. He started to speak, then pressed his lips together. His eyes found the floor. I waited, but no words came. The floor took his apology and held it before it reached me. Henry moved toward the table and set both palms on the wood. If you can forgive me, we can call a new meeting and make this right in front of the family. We can show respect. We can ask you to sit at the center, not the side. He tried to smile. It looked like a crack running along a wall that had been painted too many times. I don't need a meeting, I said. The judge already spoke. He winced at the word judge. The house did not like that word. Yes, he said, softer. She spoke clearly. He pushed the folder toward me as if he feared it might burn his hands. But a house is not built out of orders. It is built out of meals and names. Meals and names broke me when paper could not, I said. My throat tightened. I took a breath and made it slow. I stood here for years and learned your rules and swallowed your insults because I thought that was the price of belonging. When it mattered, you used belonging as a rope. I will not wear it again. Carlos stepped in then. I was wrong, he said, so low I almost missed it. I should have stood next to you. He stopped there. He did not add the next sentence, the one that would explain why he didn't. I heard it anyway. He had been standing next to his childhood, and it had filled the space where I was supposed to be. Henry lifted his eyes. Let me start again, he said. Come back into the house. Let us build a new table. I will come to pray, I said. I will come to light incense and bring flowers. I will not come to be arranged. The sentence surprised me with its calm. My hands were steady. He held my gaze and then looked down. The apology he had brought was not enough to cross the distance between what he wanted and what I could give. He seemed to understand that. His shoulders lowered a degree. He said he would instruct the accountant to return the transfers and open the books to a neutral administrator. He said he would speak to Valeria. He said he would ask Carlos to make amends as a son and as a husband. The words had the shape of repair. I could not place them on the frame of our life. I walked to the altar and lit a stick of incense. The smoke curled, found the old paths up the wall. I don't hate you, I said without turning. I'm done being bent to fit your story. What story will you live in then? Henry asked. His voice had lost its edge. Mine, I said. I placed the incense in the bowl. The ash stirred. In the glass behind the photo, my face blurred into hers. I remembered how she would press my hand when a meal went well, how she would quietly hand me an envelope to cover the cost of a dish I had made, how she would never say the word thank you in front of the men, and how her eyes had said it anyway. When I turned, Henry had moved back a step. He looked older. Carlos stood with his weight on one foot like a boy who had been called to the front of class and could not remember the answer. He said my name. I waited. He said he would try to become the man he had promised to be. I told him I hoped he would. I did not say whether I would wait for it. I picked up the folder. The court seal pressed through the paper like a quiet stamp. I slid the strap of my bag over my shoulder. I told Henry I would send copies of the administrator's instructions. I told Carlos to call Julia if he had questions. Their silence followed me to the entry. At the door, I looked back. The altar lamp threw a small halo on the frame of her portrait. Her mouth in the photo was almost smiling, or maybe it was only the way the light struck the glass. I tried to feel triumph and could not. Justice had stood up in a room and spoken, and I was grateful. But gratitude is not the same as wholeness. The house was intact. The family was not. My chest felt hollow, the good kind that lets you breathe, and the bad kind that echoes. I put my hand to the wood of the door, cool and familiar, and then I stepped outside into the late afternoon, the air thin, the sky bright. My mother's face still warm behind me, and yet impossibly far. I packed in the quiet hour after lunch when the house dozed and phones stopped buzzing. The suitcase lay open on the bed like a flat mouth. I folded shirts into halves and then into halves again, as if neat edges could steady me. In the closet, a row of dresses blinked in the dim light. I chose two and left the rest for donation. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old perfume. I found a scarf I had borrowed from her once and washed and returned. I laid it across the top of the clothes and smoothed it with my palm. When I first came here as a new wife, she had smiled a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She placed a hand on my shoulder and guided me toward the kitchen. "Learn our pace," she said. I tried. I learned which bowls belonged to soup and which to greens. I learned to keep my voice soft when the men talked accounts. Today, I could still see her smile, almost amused, almost proud, as if she were testing a bridge with her weight. The memory pricked and then warmed. I tucked it into the suitcase the way you tuck a scarf between layers so it will not crease. Carlos stood in the doorway with his hands in his pockets. He watched me fold my sweater and set it beside the ledger and the court copy. He cleared his throat and said my name the way you say a word you found on the floor and are not sure where to put. I told him he did not need to help. He stepped into the room anyway and sat on the edge of the chair, knees touching the carpet. "I will fix this," he said. He said the judge had spoken, that he would follow every instruction, that he would show the family he had changed. His voice grew thin as he listed future gestures like beads, meetings, apologies, transparency. He reached for the side of the suitcase and then withdrew his hand. "I do not want you to go," he said, almost a whisper. I told him I believed he wanted repair. I also told him I had no room left for a life that required me to ask permission to be believed. He looked at the wall as if an answer might be written there. I remembered the nights he promised to stand next to me and how, when it mattered, he had stepped to the side and let the old story close around me like a gate. I said I would not live under that gate. He said he loved me. I said I wanted to love myself more than I feared solitude. He nodded, jaw tight, the way men do when they accept a blow they cannot deflect. He stood and gathered a stack of folded towels from the dresser and carried them to the hall. A small movement dressed as help. I zipped the suitcase partway and checked drawers. A hairbrush, 2 pairs of socks, the ring I wore when we bought the car. I left the ring on the tray by the mirror. In the glass, my face was pale and steady. From down the hall came the quick retreat of footsteps. Valeria. She had been circling all morning like a cat around a fence. If she passed the door, she turned her head away. If our eyes met, hers slid to the floor. I did not chase her. My words to her would be simple, and I had already said them without sound. I am not your story. I carried the suitcase to the living room. The altar lamp burned the same patient red. Henry was not home. The space felt larger without his habit of filling it with direction. Carlos followed me with a set of keys in his hand. He held out the ring we had used for years. I said I had copies for the administrator and would surrender mine now. He closed his fingers and then opened them again. I set my keys on the table, the metal soft as a sigh against the wood. For a moment we stood with nothing to do. Then he stepped forward as if to hug me. I took a half step back, not unkindly, but clear. He lifted his hands and let them fall. "You will call," he said. "I will send the papers," I said. He swallowed. "I hope you find peace," he said. I told him peace was not something you find. It is something you stop excusing yourself away from. I picked up the suitcase handle. It felt heavier than it should. I walked to the door. The hallway runner curled a little at the corner. I pressed it flat with my foot, a reflex learned in a house that wanted neatness. I turned the deadbolt for the last time and opened the door. The afternoon light was bright and clean. Carlos said my name again. I did not turn. He said, "Thank you for what you did for her." That landed like a soft cloth. I nodded without looking back. I stepped out and pulled the door until the latch met the strike with a small click that sounded like a line being drawn. On the porch, the air smelled of cut grass and orange peel. Somewhere beyond the hedge, a child laughed, once and then again, a sound like water finding a shallow run. The suitcase wheels bumped on the first step. I drew a breath that went all the way down. The weight I had been carrying slipped a notch inside my chest, and space opened. I did not know where I would sleep next month or which table would learn my hands, but the sky was wide, and the sound of that laughter moved through me like a gate swinging on a new hinge. I lifted the handle higher, took the next step, and let the sun fall on my face. 1 year later, I sit at my small table and write this down. The window faces east. Morning slips over the sill and warms the wood. The apartment smells faintly of soap and coffee. A basil plant on the ledge leans toward the light like a quiet animal. The rooms are mine. The dishes are mine. The silence belongs to no one but me. I think of her. I think of the incense that clung to my hair, of the ledger with neat lines, of the way she underlined a single word and made it a bridge. I think of long meals that were supposed to teach me patience, and instead taught me the price of silence. I think of the courtroom where paper spoke in a voice no cousin could drown. The memories arrive in a calm row, like bowls set on a tray. I lift each one and set it back down. Nothing spills. Julia comes by with pastries from the corner shop. She kicks off her shoes and sets her bag on a chair. We do not talk about the case anymore. We do talk about rent and pollen and a class she is taking for no reason except joy. She peeks into the second room and smiles. The crib stands under a paper mobile I cut from old maps. The baby is asleep, mouth open, a star of milk on her lip. Julia whispers that she can see my mother in the angle of the child's brow. I laugh and say the baby is not blood, but love draws its own family tree. The adoption papers sit in a folder with my name alone on the tab. It took months and many interviews. It took the kind of certainty I used to borrow from other people. Now I carry it inside my ribs. At night, I wake to the small sound she makes when a dream turns. I stand at the crib and place my hand on her back. The warmth is real. The rise and fall is real. I whisper her name and the room settles. Work pays the bills. It is not glamorous. I balance accounts for a clinic and build small budgets for a shelter. Numbers soothe me. They obey when you keep them honest. I send money each month to a fund in my mother's name. The administrator mails a report with tidy columns. I file it in a drawer that does not lie. News from the old house arrives in careful phrases. Henry keeps his voice low when he calls. He tells me the administrator is strict, and the shop has learned to breathe without threats. He says Valeria has taken a job 2 cities away. He does not ask me to come back. He tells me about the altar flowers, about the way the lamp burns steady at night. Sometimes he stops speaking and the line fills with the sound of his breath. I say I hope he is eating. He says he is trying. We hang up before the past wakes. Carlos writes twice. He says he is sober now about what he chose and what he did not choose. He says he will not ask me to forgive him, that he will try to be the man he was supposed to be, even if I never see it. I send back a sentence that wishes him health. It is true. There is no other sentence to send. In the afternoons, I push the stroller to the park. The baby laughs at dogs and at the crumpled sound of paper bags. I sit on a bench and read aloud from a thin book until the light softens. Sometimes I think of the day on the porch when a child laughed on the other side of the hedge and how that sound opened a door in my chest. I live in that open room now. Julia returns on Sundays with oranges. We slice them at the sink and eat them over the trash can so the juice does not run. We argue about nothing, and it feels like practice for a long life. When she leaves, she touches the doorframe the way my mother used to, a small blessing made of habit. Today, after the baby sleeps, I take the little candle from the cupboard and set it on a saucer. I place the photo on the table. It is not the portrait from the altar. It is the one where she stands in the kitchen with a spoon and a half smile, as if tasting the air. I strike a match. The flame catches, then steadies. I say a few words in Vietnamese, clumsy but sincere. I tell her I kept the records. I tell her the house did not become a weapon. I tell her the truth stood up when it mattered. Then I whisper the sentence I carried for a year. I kept my promise. Smoke climbs in a thin blue ribbon and disappears. The window is open an inch. Outside, a bike bell rings once, then twice. The basil leaf trembles and goes still. I do not know what shape the next years will take. I do not know if the baby will love numbers or music or the silence between. I know how to hold a story without turning it into a cage. I know how to say no and how to mean it. I know how to light a candle and blow it out and let the room be only a room again. I set down my pen. Sunlight lays itself across the table and touches my wrist. I look toward the doorway, toward the small crib and the future beyond it, and I smile. Outside, the sky was just breaking with dawn, sunlight slipping through the curtains and resting on the closed stack of papers. I realize that filial piety does not mean bowing in silence, but must go hand in hand with boundaries and mutual respect. Justice may arrive late, but when it comes with clear evidence and rightful law, it can free a life from its chains. I breathed in the warm scent of freshly cooked rice drifting from the small kitchen and felt truly at peace. If this story touched you, please like, share, subscribe, and leave a comment. Type 1 if you empathize. Type 2 if you think there is still something to improve.